So last we left the Cube about a month, I made upgrades to it and showed them off, at least in software, while looking at some games, some of which would not run under Mac OS X, because at the time I was running a GeForce 6200 as the GPU, and unfortunately that card is only good for OS X. It will not run in OS 9 because it lacks OS 9 drivers. So if you're going to use a card like that, you're stuck with OS X, specifically 10.4 or 10.5. And given that most of the games I play on these old systems are OS 9 games, that created quite a bit of an issue for me. So while I really liked having the Cube, unfortunately its use to me at the time was kind of limited because I had to either rely on OS X ports for the games I liked or hope that they would run in Classic, which usually they did not. So here we are later, and I think we've got a solution to that problem. I had to also make right some of the upgrades I made to this Cube, as we will show off in just a moment when I get it out of its case. So let's go ahead and do that, actually. And you may see a massive hint as to what's coming, but we'll go ahead and leave the suspense. Ah, delicious. So here's the Cube taken out of its case, and when I say that I made a not so kosher upgrade to the system, it's because when I put the 1.4 gigahertz card in here, you need to really get a better cooling solution in here to keep the internals nice and cool, because the convection cooling only works so well when you have the stock 450 megahertz CPU in here. When we're pushing 1.4 gigahertz, it's going to put out a lot more heat, and the convection cooling alone is not going to be enough to keep the CPU from overheating. So what I initially did was I had a ill-sized fan actually sitting in this channel here where the hard drive normally would go, blowing directly at the heatsink, forcing air over it. This is not ideal, but it's what I had on hand at the time, and it did keep the Cube sufficiently cool, at least with the setup I had back then. And the problem with that was that it would actually force air both out the bottom and out the top, and the air would kind of have to find its own way back out of the Cube, even though it was being forced over the heatsink, which was better than convection, but I would argue not as ideal as it should be. Now, with the Cubes, there is a base fan that you can put into them because they actually thought that the Cube needed active cooling, and it kind of does, if we're honest. So they designed a slot for a fan at the bottom here, and you kind of can't see it from here. It's really hard to see, but it's in there. And Steve Jobs wanted this to be a fanless system at the very last minute, so they pulled the fan out and left the artifact of the fan mount there. So that's what a lot of Cube owners do. They will pull the logic board out to get to that little fan mounting bit, and they will buy a proper fan to stick in there and run it off the VRM, because the VRM actually has a header for a fan to plug into, clearly signaling that they had intent to put a fan in here from the get-go, but they didn't because Steve Jobs wanted this to be a silent system, which is kind of funny because the hard drive would be anything but silent, but I digress. So that not very kosher upgrade, which is pointing a fan in the wrong direction to try and move more air through here, was undone because I had to pull the whole logic board out, and I put in a proper fan because thankfully Amazon made things kind of cheap, and I was able to find the proper size fan for less than $10. It's a bit on the loud side, but boy does it move quite a lot of air. And it actually has a double effect here because it pulls so much air through the bottom channel that it hopefully forces more air to come in from the back opening and just get all up in here. And it pulls more air over the ports, which is important because I want more air, more colder air, to get over into the graphics card side of the Cube. Because while the GeForce 6200 runs cool enough to be somewhat okay, the card I replaced it with, because yes, I did replace it with another card, needs a little bit more help in the cooling department despite having an onboard fan. And the big surprise here, which is not really a surprise if you follow me on social media or you follow my blog, is this. To those who know what this is, I am not joking you, this is a real deal GeForce 3. And you might be thinking, oh, it's just a GeForce 3. What's so special about that? And the thing with the GeForce 3 is these cards are literally unobtainium. I believe you can possibly get a PC version and flash it over, but the Mac variant of the cards, which of that I am sure because it has an ADC port on the back here, these are really hard to find, if not impossible. I could not find one on eBay, and from what I understand, when these do go on sale, they command a very high price. So you might be thinking, well, Exodium, how did you get your hands on one? Because there's no way you paid fair market value for that, and you'd be right. Because a good friend of the channel actually donated this to me because he found it in a trashed G4 that was beyond saving, so he decided to part it out, and he asked if I wanted this card, because he knew I was looking for cube parts to really beef this thing up. So he said, I will give you this card, however, you need to take this cube to VCF West 2024. So I do intend on doing that, and yeah, this is going to be part of the exhibit for VCF West 2024. Pretty cool. And you might also be asking, well, wait a minute, that's a worse card than the G4 6200. What are you doing? Well, like I said earlier, my main forte with vintage gaming is macOS 9 stuff and macOS 8.6 and all that. macOS Classic is an umbrella term here. And this is the ultimate card that you can put into one of these cubes that is compatible with classic macOS, which sucks because, again, they are really hard to find. I'm sure someone out there is going to be like, oh, I've got like 3 of them. They're not that rare. No. If you don't have connections to any retro communities, these things are literally unobtainium. You're not just going to stroll onto eBay and find one. And if you do, you should go buy all of the lottery tickets. Nonetheless, enough bragging about the card. I've also made a few changes here to the VRM. Now, I do actually have replacement MOSFETs for this VRM, and I'm gonna put them on. However, I'm waiting for DOSDude1 to verify that these MOSFETs are the ones I need. He suggested ones that, at least looking at the spec sheet, they should be drop-in replacements and they should be able to take much more abuse than the ones that are on here. However, he was like, well, before you put those on, be sure to like measure your outputs and make sure everything is still within spec. And I don't have the means to energize this VRM outside of the cube case, so he's going to go ahead and do the mod on his own cube and make sure that everything looks good. And then once he's done it, I'm going to go ahead and do it on mine. I've already got the MOSFETs ready to go, but until such a time happens, because he is a very busy man, I have put heat sinks on the MOSFETs to give them a little more thermal headroom, and thankfully they do seem to be helping quite a bit. They are passing quite a bit of heat, which is really nice. I did also get, on the advice of Tech Ambrosia, some other things, but unfortunately I don't think these are going to move enough air to have any consequence. These are blower fans that you would use on, say, a 3D printer or something like that. And I was going to put them in here to help move more air through the GPU. Unfortunately, those do not move very much air for what they are, so yeah, kind of unfortunate, but what can you do? Because the main problem here is that this part of the cube gets no air circulation. This is all convection. The base fan doesn't reach over here, and that's why I was saying having more air passing along the bottom here gives this more of a chance to get cool than the way I had it before, where hot air was being forced through the bottom too, because the hot air was trying to escape by any means necessary after being forced into the CPU heatsink by a fan aimed directly at it, not through it. So hopefully, with air now passing up and out of the case, this takes a lot of thermal stress off the middle of the cube and hopefully makes the whole thing run a little bit cooler and gives the video card a little bit more headroom to kind of play around in, because this thing gets really hot. The heat sinks on here will get up to about 70 Celsius, which is quite toasty, and that's kind of where I stopped the test at. But what also kind of sucks is the clearance here for this fan, because this fan will pull in air directly from the top of it. It doesn't have a lot of room to play around when the chassis is fully installed. So one of the things I thought about doing, if we move this aside for a moment and grab the chassis, is that there is actually an air gap between the metal here and the acrylic on the outside. And I believe if we undo these screws in here, the metal will actually come away from the acrylic. And what I can do, something I thought about doing at least, is maybe putting some vent holes in the metal, because this chassis is not in the best condition. Not sure if you can tell on camera, but in person, it's all banged up, and I don't really care personally because, I mean, it's a cube. I'm lucky to have a cube to begin with, but I thought about putting a hole somewhere in the metal chassis to allow fresh air into the GPU compartment, and just maybe putting a nice sticker over the back of this, because no one's going to be seeing the back at VCF anyway, so no one's going to care but me. But yeah, that's something maybe for another day, but for right now, that's really it. There's not really much else to go on here. So let's go ahead and put this thing back in. Slide that in very nicely here. Click down that handle, and that is one of the most satisfying things ever. So before we go on to power this thing up, this thing put me through hell and back when trying to get it back in working order. Alright, so unfortunately this is not going to be as detailed as I want it to be, because the standoff for the graphics card has started free spinning, and by free spinning I mean it's starting to unscrew from the logic board rather than unscrewing at the top here so I can remove the GPU. But when you're putting the cube back together from having taken it apart completely, there are three little standoffs that go between the CPU card and heat spreader and the logic board itself. They're on the underside. In fact, I can show you that right here. This guy right here, this part, the part where you can see the thermal paste kind of spilled over, that's the heat spreader. And you have little spacers in there that kind of keep space between the logic board and the CPU card. Now you want to make sure that when you're putting this thing back together, those spacers are perfectly centered. You should be able to see the lip of them on this side of the logic board when you're screwing everything back in. I didn't do this. And what ended up happening was everything was making just good enough contact to where the CPU wasn't able to cook itself alive, but it was running so hot that everything was starting to crash and everything was starting to kernel panic, and I would get dumped out to open firmware, and a bunch of issues were happening. And I spent hours upon hours trying to figure out what was going on, only to find out that the spacer here at the back, which was under this spot under the video card, had been off-center this entire time and was causing things to not make good enough contact where the CPU could not adequately cool itself. So when you're putting this thing back together, pay very special attention to those spacers and make sure they are set in place and they have not fallen off center, because if they have, you will be having a really bad time and you'll be just chasing your own tail over and over trying to figure out what went wrong when it's just something stupidly simple like that has gone wrong. So that's the PSA for the day on this thing. So let's put it back together and get it all hooked up. Alright, now that we're booted into OS 9, which runs perfectly, I might add. Unfortunately, I had to fully reinstall everything because I thought the problem with the CPU mounting was my OS install had become corrupt, and I had just tried to reinstall everything, and when it wouldn't let me even reinstall the OS, I knew something was not quite right, and I needed to recheck my work a few times over. So, in System Profiler, I mean, there's not really much to see here, if we're honest, because we already showed it off. We still have 1.5 gigs of RAM, but now we have 64 megabytes of video memory because we are running the GeForce 3. So let's go ahead and run some games now that we actually can run some games. So we have Quake 3, which should not be out here because we are running OS 10 on this as well. I have a games folder right in here just to have that kind of sequestered away from OS 10. So I already have all the ISOs I would need mounted. So let's start out strong with some Quake 3. We do have audio. We're just using default settings.
Welcome to Quake 3 Arena.
As we can see, it runs really, really good. I can actually play the game, unlike OS 10. We go to setup. We can go to system. 640 by 480. I could probably go higher, but I'm not going to.
Let's crash to win this arena. You have taken the lead.
Mouse tracking is a little off, but it is what it is.
3 frags left. 2 frags left.
Anyway, we know how Quake runs. runs pretty damn well. Let's go over to Unreal Tournament now. And it's going to recommend Rave. So we're going to do Rave, and it's going to do high everything, but standard video resolution, which, I mean, 640 by 480 is perfectly serviceable for games at this time, so I'm not going to question it. And we are running version 436, so this will connect to servers running 436, which was the last official version released by Epic. As we can see, the intro is running pretty good. Practice session, capture the flag, and one of my favorite maps. I think this is one of everybody's favorite maps, Facing Worlds. Right. As we can see, it's running pretty good. Yeah, catch me if you can, buddy.
I'm in position.
And yeah, there we go. I could get lost in this game for a while. Let's see if we can bring it up to 800 by 600 and we'll see what happens. How are we looking now? Yeah, still running pretty respectably. Gee, that still feels like 60 FPS to me. Textures look amazing. Yeah, that's Unreal Tournament. We could also run Diablo 2, but that's going to probably run exactly the same as it did on the previous video we did, so we'll get to that in a minute. But let's play something basic and addicting. Are you even impressed that it runs so well? I mean, this is a game meant for black and white max. Let's run Diablo 2. Yeah, and this is likely to just run the very same. And we'll see what happens. Gotta rep the Sorceress. It's my main back in the day. Turn this all the way up. Diablo 2 is a game that really should run better than it does on hardware like this, but I always hated perspective mode. It just looked weird to me, so I usually turn that off even if I've got good hardware. But as before, we are averaging about 25 FPS locked. And it's nice and rainy, as it should be. Nothing really to see here. Again, it literally runs the same as it did on the previous video. And I mean, for giggles, we can go ahead and run Unreal, but if Unreal Tournament ran pretty good, Unreal should run just as well, and it does. The flames here are just going nuts because of how fast this thing is running. Unfortunately, I do not have this up to the point where I usually have this. Oddly, it has this thing where it just runs a little too fast sometimes. I'm not sure what that's about, but it runs pretty good. No complaints here. Yeah, it just randomly it's weird. It just randomly runs a little too fast. Maybe this system is too good for Unreal. That's something. It's like if I look down, it just runs too fast. Yeah, that's Unreal. Now, I am running dual boot, as you can probably tell. and we are going to go ahead and just boot this thing up into an OS that I'm nostalgic for here. Because my first taste of OS 10 was when I had a G3 iMac back in the day. It was believe a Graphite 400 megahertz. It was a DVSE, and I ran OS 9 on that thing until a good friend of mine, the very good friend who got me into computers to begin with, was like, why don't we just throw OS 10 on that thing for you? Because OS 10 is awesome. So originally we were going to put Tiger on it, but that ended up not working out. So, well, we could put Jaguar on it. So Jaguar is the version of Mac OS 10 that I am very nostalgic for because it is where I got my start as far as OS 10 is concerned. So what is very interesting with Jaguar is you need to have the 10.2.8 combo update actually local to the machine, or an ability to download it from like an FTP site, because usually what I do is I will go and connect to my server and just grab stuff from there, and I can, because I just guessed access my software store here. But 10.2.0 and older versions of 10.2 have this problem where if you click on something on a network share, it just disappears. Like it was never there to begin with. So if you click something to try and drag it off of your network server, it just vaporizes like it was never there. So usually I have, if I go over here to macOS 10, OS updates, I've got a whole bunch of updates here for various versions of Mac OS 10. I need to reorganize them because I have a few in their OS folders here, and NAS is taking a minute to spin up there. By going to Panther here, and like here's various bits, and with the combo update right there for Panther. So normally I would just grab it off here and bring it onto my machine, but I can't do that if everything is bugged. So I had to go grab a FireWire drive, which is this pile of junk here. It is taped together. Yeah, it's quite funny. But I had to bring that over and copy the firmware file directly to that, and then plug it in to my Mac and go from there. You can also drop into OS 9, because if we reboot into OS 9, my NAS is actually compatible with old OSs like Mac OS 9. I believe the AFP implementation on my NAS is old enough that OS 9 can reach it to some extent. And I could just go into OS 9, which isn't bothered by that bug, grab the file, bring it to the root of the hard drive, then reboot in OS 10 and apply the update. Either way, it's a big PSA that if you're going to run an old version of OS 10 like 10.2.x, you're going to need to have those updates locally available, because if you try to reach out to a network share to grab them, you're going to have a really bad time. So since we're already connected to the network, I can go to Chooser and go to Apple Share. And in order for this to work, you have to be able to manually input the IP address. And I believe you can only do this as a Mac OS 8.1 and higher, or maybe 7.6 with updated Open Transport. I do not remember. And now, unfortunately, you cannot log in because it will stop you if I try to enter my password here. It's going to whine that my password won't work because it can only go to so many characters. So we just say screw that and connect as guest. There's software. It's going to whine, but I can just go in here and bam, there's all the stuff I ever need right there. So yeah, that's it for this video. Hopefully you enjoyed looking at the cube with me, and well, till next time, I'll see you guys later. Hopefully I'll try to make content a little more often, but you know, do the engagement things if you enjoyed this video. You know, subscribe maybe if you liked what you saw here and want to see more of it. Hopefully again more often, but until next time, I will see you all later.